final portion of today's proceedings, which is going to be a talk by Charles Provan of Pennsylvania on his research into one of the most extraordinary episodes of World War II, which is the virtually unknown sequence of events when the American army liberated the Nazi concentration camp at Dachau just outside Munich in southern Germany. We all know from the pictures and the newspapers and the television media about Dachau and about what the Allies found when they entered the camp. We've seen the pictures of the emaciated bodies, the railroad trucks, the GIs, the barbed wire, the watchtowers. What isn't generally known is the other side of the coin, which is what happened in one corner of the camp on the day that the American army took that site over. It's a horrifying story, it's a very sad story, and Charles Provan accidentally stumbled across the original authentic American transcripts and American army records relating to this atrocity. And he's going to tell us about this episode, and I, for one, am intensely looking forward to what he has to say. Charles Provan.
Well, thanks. Can everybody hear me in the back? Okay. I've always been told I have an obnoxiously loud voice anyway, so it shouldn't be that hard for you to hear me. As Mr. Irving said, I stumbled into the report that we're going to talk about by accident. As many of you probably know that I'm a great fan of the criminal judge of the Waffen-SS, Dr. Conrad Morgan, whose duty it was to prosecute crimes that took place in the concentration camps during the war, which of course there's no movie about and none pending that I know of. But I've always admired Dr. Morgan greatly. He's supposed to be passed away now, but in any case, Dr. Morgan turned himself over to the American authorities because they wanted him to talk to him for war crimes information. Since he was the main guy who investigated the war crimes on the German side during the war, they wanted to talk to him. They put out notices that if anybody saw him, he was to be brought in. So he voluntarily turned himself over after escaping Soviet custody, and was promptly arrested and thrown into jail with many of the same fellows that he prosecuted and investigated during the war. Now, the reason, I'll just say this quickly, when Dr. Morgan was arrested by the Americans in September of 1945, he wrote depositions that have disappeared and nobody's found them since, from about September of 1945 to approximately October, November. His depositions that he made during that time period, which would be invaluable actually, have disappeared and nobody's seen them since then. And that's what I was trying to find in the National Archives. Dr. Morgan had mentioned that he surrendered to the 7th Army, or portions of the 7th Army and also the 3rd Army when they divided Germany out. And so I was looking at the National Archives through the 7th Army records to see if I could find something. So I was going through the big list on all these things, and I noticed a line that said Dachau massacre. So I thought maybe there was some big massacre that the Nazis did or something like that. And so I asked them to pull the file, and they did. And when I looked at it, then I realized that it was the long-lost official report of the U.S. Army on the massacre of German prisoners which took place at Dachau. And I could really hardly believe my eyes, because according to the rumors that had floated around, the copies were supposed to have been destroyed. And but it turns out it was a copy made by the investigative U.S. detective who was in charge of investigating the case. What happened was that one of the officers from the 42nd Division, let me just give you some background. If you picture sort of a rectangle, it's not like a rectangle really. The concentration camp at Dachau has a railroad line running into it through an opening on the southwest corner. Okay, at the end of the war, when the Germans were almost beat to pieces and had almost nothing left, 2 U.S. divisions were racing through Germany to get to the city of Dachau. Anyway, what happened was both of these divisions reached the Dachau concentration camp at almost the same time, and for 50 years they've been arguing on who got there first. So I'll cast my vote for the 45th Division instead of the 42nd. So I'll probably end up getting shot by somebody from the 42nd Division somewhere, I suppose. But in any case, the 45th entered into the concentration camp through the rail line in the southwest corner. Shortly after they got there and moved into the concentration camp, the 42nd Division showed up. Portions of the 42nd saw the same railroad track, went in, and turned in a different direction on the inside. As it turns out, both elements of the 45th and the 42nd Division were investigated for war crimes because both of them executed prisoners, as we'll see. Now, as a little bit of background, I'd like to give you some quotes concerning concentration camps from Adolf Hitler, what he said he recommended be done to concentration camp inmates in case of a danger would arise. This is from Hitler's Table Talk. I only have the English version from Trevor Roper. This is what Hitler said on April the 7th, 1942. He said, "If the slightest attempt at a riot were to break out at this moment anywhere in the whole Reich, I'd take immediate measures against it. Here's what I'd do. A, on the same day, all the leaders of the opposition, including the leaders of the Catholic Party, would be arrested and executed. B, all the occupants of the concentration camps would be shot within 3 days. C, all the criminals on our lists, and it would make little difference whether they were in prison or at liberty, would be shot within the same period. The extermination of these few hundreds or thousands of men would make other measures superfluous, for the riot would be aborted for lack of ringleaders and accomplices." That's a quote from 1942. But the problem of what to do with the concentration camps came up near the end of the war when Germany was in a state of total collapse. And at that time, there's a very interesting section from Mr. Irving's book, Hitler's War. And this was part of the testimony mentioned in the Ernst Zundel trial. This is from Ernst Zundel's big pink book, but it occurs in Hitler's War also. Mr. Irving spent a lot of time talking with members of Hitler's staff and asking them if they ever had heard Hitler talk about, exterminating people or killing them or whatever. And the SS Colonel Otto Gunsch said this, "Mr. Irving, I remember one episode only, right at the end of the war, when Heinrich Himmler in Hitler's war conference said, 'Mein Führer, the American troops are advancing on Weimar.'" Weimar was the city where the Buchenwald concentration camp, probably most of you heard of that one, was located. He says, "Mein Führer, the American troops are advancing on Weimar. They are about to overrun a concentration camp. I believe it must have been Buchenwald. What are your instructions about the camp? Should I evacuate the prisoners?" And Hitler said to Himmler, "Herr Reichsführer, stay behind until the conference is over." After the conference was over, according to Otto Gunsch, or Gunsche, who was the only eyewitness, Hitler said to Himmler, "Make sure that all the prisoners are liquidated before the Americans overrun the camp if they cannot be evacuated." The second time I had Gunsch tell the story to me, which was 2 or 3 years later, as a check to see if his memory had changed, he added the sentence in Hitler's mouth. Hitler said, "Make sure that all the prisoners are liquidated if they cannot be evacuated. I don't want to think of these criminals being turned loose on the local German population." Now, Hitler said this, according to Otto Gunsch, right before the Americans overran the Buchenwald concentration camp. The Buchenwald concentration camp was evacuated, big chunks of it, by railroad convoys around the 7th and 8th of April 1945. And the commander of the camp, whose name was Hermann Pister, protested against shipping them out because the railroads were all smashed up, there wasn't enough food to go around, and he wanted to voluntarily turn the camp over to the Americans. But he was overruled and had to evacuate. It's sort of an unusual story. Pister was actually a good fellow compared to his previous predecessor, who many of you may have known, Koch, the concentration commander. He was the husband of Ilse Koch, who committed suicide because she kept getting thrown in jail after the war. She was charged with making lampshades out of tattoos and things like that. It turned out all false. But in any case, the commandant of Buchenwald wanted to turn it over voluntarily, but he was forced by orders to evacuate a lot of the prisoners. He eventually turned the prison camp over to the camp leadership and then evacuated, pulled the SS guards out. But all the SS guards didn't escape. It's vague on this. The communist leadership at Buchenwald, because that's who were the leaders of the prisoners, the hardcore communists, rounded up about 80 SS guards who were outside the camp, and all it says in the communist records is that they rounded up 80 guards and captured them. But in a recent book on the Holocaust called Inside the Vicious Heart, it says that the prisoners were all executed by the camp people. In any case, there were rumors of riots around Buchenwald. Okay, some of the prisoners were rumored to have raped and pillaged Germans in the vicinity of the city of Weimar. Reuters issued a news conference or a press release that said that concentration camp commanders were pillaging in the area. That made things even worse for evacuating the camps, because when Hitler got the report that there were all kind of riots and pillaging, he gave an additional order, repeating his order that anybody not able to be evacuated was to be executed, because that would prevent them from potentially doing any harm. So that's what happened. Now, one of the trains, the reason I'm mentioning all this Buchenwald information is, one of the trains that was evacuated from Buchenwald that was filled with, say, some 5,000, 4,000, I forget the exact total, was loaded up with 3 days worth of food and instructed to go to a place where they would be safe. But the Allies were launching total destruction of the German rail line. The rail lines were all smashed up. They couldn't get anywhere, and the train was waylaid. The prisoners ran out of food. In the area where they ran out in southern Germany, a pastor from the area, an evangelical pastor, had heard about the prisoners starving and organized a food collection. That saved the prisoners for a few more days, but eventually all the food ran out. The train was forced back on the line by orders, and by the time it got to Dachau, the prisoners were out of food, and not only that, the train had been machine gunned and strafed by the US Air Force. Okay, so you can imagine prisoners who are at the bottom of the totem pole in Germany, the same way prisoners were at the bottom of the totem pole here, only we had plenty of food. So the food's out, the train is attacked by US troops, and by the time it arrived into Dachau, Dachau was crammed full of people already because everybody was getting evacuated and pushed into the camp. And the train was basically just parked outside of the camp where it was when the Americans showed up. And that set in line a really horrible catastrophe. What happened was both of the divisions, as I mentioned, entered through the southwest corner of the Dachau concentration camp, and both of them ran into the railroad trains. Now, the railroad trains were filled with some 1,000 to 2,000 dead and emaciated people. The pictures are really horrible. There's plenty of pictures of them. They noticed that the walls had been machine gunned and attacked by US planes, but when they saw this, they accepted it as proof of the brutality of the National Socialists. They didn't know that Himmler was only evacuating the prisoners from the concentration camp because if they left them there, he was under orders to execute them. So a slim chance is better than none. There was only 3 days worth of food. What I'm saying is that as far as a deliberate, willful crime, this is not part of any extermination plan. It's a total chaos at the end of the war. I can also say this from German sources, including the fellow I like very much, Konrad Morgan, and his mortal enemy, Rudolf Höss, who was the commandant of Auschwitz-Birkenau. They hated each other, mainly because Höss was the subject of a criminal investigation for rape at Auschwitz-Birkenau, and Morgan had captured the girl who was raped and smuggled her out of the camp. So there was no love lost between either of them, but they both said at the end of the war that the conditions at Belsen and at Dachau and the other camps where everybody was starving to death was not part of an extermination plan. It was total chaos, destruction, no food. The rail lines were all destroyed. And I'm sure you know by that time, the United States was, the U.S. Air Force pilots were ordered to kill and destroy even wagons, farm wagons, kids on the street, bicyclers. I've read reports of kids riding bicycles down the street were machine gunned by P-51s. So basically, Germany's a total shambles. There's no food. And so what happened was the train was the first thing seen by the U.S. troops. Now, doesn't it infuriate you to know that German soldiers were held at like half or third rations in barbed wire encampments by the United States that was supposed to promise them decent treatment? Doesn't that make your blood boil? See? Because it's contrary to what everything that we were standing for. Okay? And I remember the first time I heard about that, it made me really angry. Well, anger, if it's not directed in a rational direction, becomes evil itself. What happened was that at the point when the 45th Division arrived at the train, 4 Germans came out to surrender. They raised their hands to surrender, and they were promptly executed by the U.S. troops and killed right on the spot. Actually, they were wounded, and then another GI from the 45th Division went in and gave them the finishing shots and shot them in the head and got rid of them. So that was the first 4. At that point, the members of the 45th Division talked among themselves, and many of the guys there remembered people talking, no prisoners, we're going to kill everybody we run into. What happened was they then penetrated the Dachau concentration camp and followed the railroad line and turned left where they saw a hospital. Okay, now the hospital was promptly invaded by the U.S. forces, who grabbed everybody from the hospital and examined them to see whether they were Waffen-SS, okay, which of course many of you probably know, Waffen-SS soldiers, most of them had tattoos specifying a blood type, and so they could be identified by lifting up their arms and seeing if they had a tattoo. So everybody with a tattoo mark who was identified as a Waffen-SS soldier, wounded and everything else, was dragged out of the hospital and brought to an open area with a high wall. It's sort of like a coal yard near the railroad tracks. The lieutenant in charge that gets the blame for shooting the prisoners there is a fellow, an Indian soldier in the U.S. Army named Lieutenant Bushyhead. Have many of you heard of his name? It's okay. Bushyhead gets most of the credit for coming up with sort of a vague plan of revenge. But actually, it was Bushyhead was a second lieutenant. His commanding officer was a First Lieutenant John Walsh, who was actually his commander when they moved into the concentration camp, and it was his idea, really. He ordered Bushyhead and the German prisoners into the coal yard. They lined them all up against the wall, and Walsh grabbed a fellow from another section, another squad in the 45th Division, who didn't actually want to be there either, and grabbed him with a machine gun and said, "Here, you put this here." Now, what happened was that Bushyhead said that it was understood they were going to kill everybody against the wall. And he said this in his testimony, okay? Bushyhead said that it was just understood, and he knew when they were lining them up, they were going to let them have it. The machine gunner didn't want to be there, okay? And the really crazy one was Lieutenant Walsh, who was lining up the U.S. soldiers at the time to kill everybody. Some of the Germans saw the Americans lining up a machine gun and started getting kind of nervous, which would be a good thing to get. The line up against the wall started moving to the side. People started getting antsy and moving. And then one of the U.S. soldiers says, "Look, they're trying to escape." They opened up a fire on the men with a machine gun. And this is a good part. I'm always pleased in stories of atrocity. You find sparks of kindness or sparks of willingness to actually abide by laws that are decent. At this point, the commander of the 45th Division section, his name was Colonel Sparks, and I'm sure you've heard of him. Sparks heard the machine gun and the rifle fire open up, realized that they'd just put a bunch of prisoners against the wall there. Sparks, the commander, came in and kicked the guy off of the machine gun and made everybody stop firing. Okay? Luckily for the Germans, a chunk of them had immediately dived to the ground when the fire opened up. Okay? So that in the pictures you may have seen, I have a chunk of pictures here, where there's 3 fellows standing, I think one fellow's standing like this, and another guy is standing like this. I guess he didn't feel like raising his hands or anything. And then there's a pile of people in front. The witnesses said that fortunately, many of the guys who were on the ground had dived there to escape. I mean, why stand in front of a wall if you're gonna have guys shooting at you? And what happened was, in the hustle and bustle, some of the German guards or doctors from the hospital evidently rushed in, grabbed whoever they could, and pulled them away when Sparks interrupted the shooting, and brought them back to the hospital. So Sparks, intervening with his own men, Lieutenant Walsh and Lieutenant Bushyhead, saved the lives of the rest of the Germans at the place, which I'm really glad for, because it's sort of depressing having a view of U.S. soldiers going around shooting people who had surrendered. Now, what happened was, Lieutenant Walsh, after this, sort of went berserk in an interview that he gave, and Sparks gave an interview later on that's on a video cassette that you can get. Lieutenant Walsh went insane, kind of, and tried to chase German guards around, shooting at them and yelling and swearing and things like that. And Sparks again knocked him down and said, "I'm taking command of this unit." Shortly after that, Walsh was back up again, and he's real vague about what happened after that. Now, what happened to the 42nd Division was this. The 42nd Division saw the railroad cars. Everybody was all upset because all the people starving, and in bad shape. They turned right at the railroad tracks and went into another section of the camp where the main door to the concentration camp was. When they arrived there, a German officer and a Red Cross representative and some other people were there to meet him, and they had a white flag of surrender. The SS man and the Red Cross fellow turned the camp over and surrendered it to the Americans. And then the American account, this part does not show up in the interrogation of the U.S. soldiers. This is from auxiliary stuff that's come out since then. The Americans say that the German officer who surrendered the place, and they call him Lieutenant Skudzinski or something, but I think they made the name up or got it wrong, because there's no record of an SS officer named Skudzinski that I could find in Washington, D.C. They have a whole roster of everybody who was an SS officer. Well, as you might expect, the SS officer who surrendered the place with no fight tried to escape, and they had to shoot him. Okay, so people who came in the front door of the place found 3 more German corpses in front of the place, and one of them had his head smashed. The other 2 were killed by rifle fire, evidently. And right next to the guy who had his head smashed, they found a Army rifle, U.S. Army rifle, that was broken in half. So you can figure out what happened to him from that. Elements of the 42nd Division continued along the main road into the camp, where they came to the watchtowers. Now, the watchtowers by this time had white flags, and they're high towers. You've probably seen some pictures of them. There were guards up in them. One of the towers, by this time, by the way, the prisoners in the camp knew that the Americans had there and were going about hog wild. You can understand their joy to get the heck out of the place. The prisoners surged forward into an electric wire, and a chunk of the prisoners were electrocuted and killed on the spot. The Germans in the tower, one of them who managed a machine gun, shot or opened up, not on the prisoners. There's no record of any prisoners, but evidently he fired warning shots above the heads of the prisoners to keep them calm. And at that point, the U.S. Army soldiers ran forward to the tower and demanded the prisoners get out. They were pretty rough. The Germans surrendered to them. They were they were lined up in several columns, and then the U.S. opened fire on them and killed everybody in the whole group. A chunk of the German soldiers fell into the canal and were washed downstream. That's why to this day they don't actually know how many people were killed. Some of the U.S. soldiers said that there were approximately like 15 to 17 soldiers that were killed, and some of them floated down the canal. Okay, now there are photographs of about 5 or 6 Germans who were dead and just lay on the grass near the edge of the canal. Okay, now the prisoners further went wild. They said that they identified more Nazi guys in the crowd. There's reports that some of the Germans had dressed in prisoner uniforms, but they were identified by the Dachau prisoners. I don't know whether that's so or whether they were really capos or, you know, part of the camp administration who served underneath the Germans. I don't know, because some of the people were ripped limb from limb and trampled to death, and we don't know how many people that happened to. There was another case where a U.S. soldier was standing there with his rifle at guard, and some inmates came and grabbed the rifle off of him and shot some people in the area. And anyway, that's basically pretty much, outside of some other isolated instances. One soldier in the 45th Division said that he didn't think it was right to kill unarmed people who were surrendering. And he said that he was standing there in the camp, and around the corner of a building ran a German soldier chased by another U.S. soldier, and the U.S. soldier shot the German in the back, and he fell over dead. The U.S. soldier who had mentioned the case said that he told the guy, he says, "You're crazy going around shooting people like this," and the guy didn't pay any attention and went off. Okay, now that basically sums up the wild times when the U.S. invaded the place. Troops from the 45th and the 42nd Division participated in executing prisoners who had surrendered, who weren't doing anything. Okay, the intent of the prisoners was known by the white flags. None of the Germans resisted or fired on any of the U.S. soldiers. There's no confirmed report that any of them ever fired at any of the Americans. They just wanted to surrender. In fact, that's what their orders were. Now, what happened was that one of the officers in the 42nd Division wrote a report which was published, okay, for some soldiers. And in the report, he had this sentence. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Oh, it's right here. I'm sorry. Okay. This is the report that triggered the investigation, of which there's one copy at the National Archives. Okay, the heading he wrote was "Death for 17 SS Men." Okay, now here's what he wrote. Amid the deafening roar of cheers, several inmates warned us of the danger by pointing to one of the 8 towers which surrounded the electrically charged fence. The tower was still manned by SS guards! Exclamation point. Half crazed ourselves at what we had just seen, we rushed the tower with rifles blazing. The SS tried to train their machine guns on us, but we quickly killed them each time a new man attempted to fire the guns. We killed all 17 SS men. Then, in mad fury, our soldiers dragged the dead bodies from the towers and emptied their rifles into the dead SS chests. Now, this guy's writing a report. He thinks he's writing some fabulous story, like everybody's supposed to say, what a great thing, he's shooting dead SS guys. Okay? But this is the passage that triggered the U.S. investigation, because, as you can guess, mutilating corpses is forbidden by law. And when this guy published this grandiose report, then it got referred to the legal division of, or the legal section of the 7th Army, and they had to send a detective to issue a report and find out what happened. He interrogated everybody that he could get his hands on, and this right here is we typed it all into the computer. This is the interrogation of the different people that he talked to. And in it you find some very interesting things. What happened was that it turned out that the lieutenant, or the colonel who wrote this magnificent triumph over the dead soldiers of the Waffen-SS, that he repudiated that story, and it turned out that he was in the group that killed the prisoners who came down from the tower. But he was smart enough to realize that he can't say, yes, after they surrendered, we let them all have it, and then shot their dead bodies anyway. So he had to say that the Germans were attempting fire. That's just a lie. None of the U.S. soldiers said that afterwards. At that tower, they heard machine guns firing when the prisoners surged forward at the barricade wall, but nobody was hit. There was not even any of the prisoners were hit. Okay, now I myself think that it was probably foolish of the SS guards to fire. I wish they had held their fire. But because when they opened up, then that gave the excuse for the U.S. to charge the place. None of the soldiers was killed when they came down from the tower until they had surrendered their weapons and were being lined up for marching away. Okay. In any case, the total of the dead seems to be around this vicinity. There were at least 4 German soldiers killed near the railroad cars, another 17 killed in the coal bin, an unknown number really, say 15, killed at the tower after they had surrendered. Some people of unknown source were ripped apart alive. And there was at least 1 German soldier killed by the prisoners when they took the U.S. rifle off of the soldier. Well, it's very good for the purposes of history that the officer in charge was an honorable, good fellow. His name was Joseph Whitaker. And he actually thought that it was wrong to kill prisoners who surrendered to you, even if they were SS soldiers. So he did a very thorough job. And of course, it's too involved for me to read the whole thing, as you can guess. There's a grand total of, he asked a grand total of 960 questions. And almost everybody who's mentioned in the famous Buchner book got grabbed by him and interrogated. Now, the colonel in charge of the U.S. troops who had stopped the U.S. soldiers from killing the rest of the German prisoners, he, unfortunately for him, got in a big argument and pulled a gun on the commander of the 42nd Division, one of the generals from the 42nd Division, and told him to get out of the concentration camp or he was going to shoot him. Okay, so the commander, Lindner, General Lindner, had wanted to file court-martial charges against the Colonel Sparks, because it's really not a good idea for a colonel to pull a gun on a general and tell him to get lost. What happened was Sparks said afterwards that Lindner had one of those riding crops, you know, sort of like you'd, I guess, associate with some British fellow who went around whacking servants or something like that. And so Sparks and his GIs were standing there. Sparks told Lindner, look, I'm under orders to seal the camp. Nobody's allowed in or out until we get medicine in here to help everybody. You have to leave. Lindner is supposed to have taken the riding crop and smacked one of Sparks' guys from the 45th Division in the head with his riding whip. And then Sparks pulled the gun, and there was like kind of a standoff. But eventually Lindner left, which I would have done too if General Sparks was pointing a gun at me. So Lindner left. They wrote reports. The 45th Division sealed the place off so they could get medical supplies. Sparks was shortly thereafter, within a few days, spirited out by one of his superior officers. The officer said, look, you're going to be under indictment soon. They're going to have an investigation. You got to get out of here. And so they got him out. So he missed the interrogation. And in fact, Colonel Whitaker, who's the detective who investigated this case, said that he tried to contact Colonel Sparks but couldn't find out where he was. So none of the U.S. Army guys told him where he was, and so he is not listed in here. But Lieutenant Walsh is, so is Lieutenant Bushyhead, okay, and so is the author of the famous book, the book by Dr. Buchner from Louisiana, who wrote, you know, the Dachau Avengers, or so, I forget what the name, what is that the title? Yeah, Day of the Avenger, that's right. Now, from the original records that are taken in May of 1945, in other words, within a few days after the U.S. soldiers killed the German prisoners of war, within a very few days, all this stuff was written around, and this shows the extreme value of having contemporary documents where you can, you know, because the rumors about Dachau have been floating around for years. I know that Field Marshal Milch of the Luftwaffe, while he was in prison, heard rumors about U.S. troops killing German prisoners at Dachau, okay, and the rumor actually spread from U.S. soldiers and on through German personnel also. Some of you have probably heard of the magazine Sigrúnin by Richard Landwehr, and in it he has reports that he had heard that when Dachau was taken over by the U.S. Army, that they emptied the entire SS hospital and killed 180 some guys in cold blood. And so rumors and eyewitness testimony in some cases have really kind of distorted. This criminal investigator said that when he was there, the 17 dead SS men that were killed at the coal bin were still there. And the reason he knew there was 17 was that he went and counted them all. Okay? Now, what he noticed is another interesting thing which does not get mentioned. Each of those 17 who didn't have a mortal wound had a head wound and was shot afterwards with a .45 pistol. And their heads were like really, you can tell 45 wound in the pictures that they have. They're like enormous. And so Colonel Whitaker concluded that somebody had gone around and given the coup de grace to the wounded Germans afterwards, but he was not able to find who it was. He suspected that some of the prisoners had done it because none of the U.S. GIs had said anything. Now, there are some interesting gross errors in Dr. Buchner's book. Okay, Dr. Buchner listed in his book that hundreds and hundreds of Waffen-SS soldiers were machine gunned at that wall. Okay, now as I told you, Lieutenant Whitaker said there was 17, but it's more interesting than that. Let me see if I can find this pretty quick. Here it is. Now, this page right here contains the contemporary wartime deposition of of Medical Officer Buchner, who later wrote the book. Okay, now, Buchner says that he was there and saw hundreds and hundreds of dead SS guys that were machine gunned by Bushyhead. But here's what he said in 1945. Okay, it says, the witness was advised of his rights under the 24th Article of War. Okay, question, do you remember the taking of the Dachau concentration camp? Answer, yes, sir. Question, were you the surgeon of the 3rd Battalion, 157th Infantry at that time? Answer, yes, sir. Question, did you see or visit a yard by the power plant where some German soldiers had been shot? Answer, I did, sir. Question, can you fix the hour at which you saw this? Answer, not with certainty, but I would judge about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The interrogator then asked him what day it was. He said he didn't remember. And the question, describe to me what you saw when you visited this yard. Now bear in mind, Buchner's book said there were, I think, at least like, I think he said there was around 300 dead guys at the wall. Is that whatever it is?
Something like 325, I think.
Okay, 540. I forget I brought the book, but my head is overflowing with facts. They fall out of my head. Okay, now, so listen, in his book he said 500 and some. Okay, but in his testimony, here's the answer to his question. Answer, we learned that one of our companies had gone through the camp and that it was something to see out there. So we got on one of the peeps, and that's marked as a mistake for jeeps. We got on one of the jeeps to visit there, and we were detained for some time by the commanding officer of the 1st Battalion, 157th Infantry, because he didn't know whether the place had been cleared. When we got there, we saw a quadrangular enclosure. There was a cement wall about 10 feet high, and inside this enclosure, I saw 15 or 16 dead and wounded soldiers lying on the wall, along the wall. Okay? Now, question, did you determine which were dead and which were wounded? Answer, I did not examine any of them, sir, but I saw several of them moving very slightly. Question, did you make any examination to determine whether or not those who were not dead could be saved? Answer, I did not. That's important. We'll get back to that. Question, was there any guard there? Answer, there was a soldier standing at the entrance of this yard whom I assumed to be a guard. Question, did you know the soldier or what company he was from? Answer, no, sir. Question, do you know whether or not any medical attention was called for these German soldiers? Answer, I do not. Now, in Buchner's book, he says that the reason that he didn't give them any medical attention is because he could see after examining them that they were beyond all hope, and that's why he didn't help them. But you can see that in his testimony here, he says that he didn't even bother to look, didn't know what shape they were in. Yeah, some were alive, but he didn't do anything. Okay? Now it gets even stranger because in Buchner's book, he said that when the investigative officer, who he does not name, talked with him and interrogated him, assured him that he thought he was innocent, didn't do anything wrong, and everything was going to be okay. As a matter of fact, Buchner was on the list of U.S. officers to be tried for war crimes, okay, by the U.S. investigator, Officer Whitaker, okay, because if you are a doctor and see somebody wounded, even if they're the enemy, it is your duty to see what you can do to help them. And Buchner, of course, didn't. Now, in his book, he said that it's because they were beyond all hope. But in this testimony, his original one, you can see that he said that he didn't even bother to check. Now, what happened was, that's basically the story. I would estimate approximately 60 Germans were executed at that time. Now, some people might say, well, gee, that's kind of small potatoes compared to 5 or 3 or 500. But actually, whenever I hear news that less people have gotten killed, it's good news, and what I would say is, thank goodness that the commander of that unit had enough sense to break in, because he could have let them keep shooting, in which case the death toll would have been much, much higher. So see, even in horrible stories, it's always of some cheer to notice that everybody's not gone mad. You know what I mean? Even in a horrendous situation, there's somebody who knows what they're supposed to do and does it. But maybe I'm just trying to be happy. I'm always glad about that. But in any case, now, this is very, very interesting because of the legal ramifications of this case. Okay, now, first of all, what did the detective recommend? Okay, he recommended that Lieutenant Bushyhead, he recommended that Lieutenant Walsh, a tech sergeant who was at the tower, and the fellow who finished off the guys at the railroad car be charged with murder, okay, with murder, okay. Now, the interesting thing, he recommended that charges also be brought of a criminal nature against Dr. Buchner because he willfully let prisoners die who he should have taken care of. So Buchner was going to be in the chargeable guys. Now, I wanted to read you this, and this is of a special interest to people who study war crimes, and you'll see why. Point 19, and this is the detective's recommendations for further action. Okay, now if you listen real close, you'll see what makes it really interesting. Point 19, it is felt that a distinction should be made between the enlisted men who shot prisoners of war while acting under orders of a responsible officer, and those 2 enlisted men, Private Pruitt and Tech 3 Wells, who acted under their own volition. Do you see what he's doing? He's saying that because the kid on the machine gun, who didn't even want to be there, okay, and was only dragged in by Lieutenant Walsh, okay, and didn't want to fire, but was ordered to by Walsh and his commanding officers, he said he recommends that he not be charged, which is a critical point. Okay, and by the way, it'll get worse than that when I show you what happened with some other cases. My position on the subject is that to be consistent, you have to either say, well, gee, soldiers get carried away in war, and sometimes they shoot guys who surrendered, and so, well, it's a war, and the war's over, and so let's forget about it. You either have to do that, or you have to say, these guys were really atrocious, just like those Einsatzgruppen guys on the Eastern Front, and so we have to execute these guys too, okay? And in any case, here's what happened. The detective submitted his report with the complete listing and interrogation of everybody, recommended that those 5 officers or 5 men be charged with murder, or 4 charged with murder, and then 1 charged with negligence of duty, and he forwarded his report to the 3rd Army. Now, the commander of the 3rd Army was, as you know, General Patton. Okay, now, I admire General Patton as a general, okay, but General Patton did some other things that I don't think are too admirable. He himself had the view that soldiers get carried away in wartime, they shoot their prisoners, and so it's an unfortunate accident and it happens, and so the soldiers are good guys, you don't do anything. There was a case that's listed in Patton's diary where he wrote, men from the 11th Division shot a bunch of prisoners, hope we can cover it up. You see? Now, I'm not saying that General Patton would be in favor of shooting prisoners, like he'd go out, oh, those guys surrendered, let them have it at that particular time. As we know later on, he wrote admiration statements for the Germans in his diary later on. But Patton was just a utilitarian military commander. Well, they're dead, can't do anything about it, and so that's that. Okay, so the report was forwarded to Patton. Patton said, I'm not charging any of these guys, and he ordered that the photographs, the report be burned and gotten rid of, and that's what happened. Nobody was charged with anything. Everybody got to go home. Now, the really, really neat thing is that the detective saved a copy, and it ended up getting filed and eventually getting put in a file folder that ended up in Washington, D.C., you know? So I kind of think it's sort of like the truth will out eventually, you know, 50 years, but it finally came out. So after all these years, we know what happened. Now, in reply to the detective's investigation, okay, here is what the general from the Third Army had to say to the detective, okay? It says, let's see. The investigation of Lieutenant or Colonel Whitaker, the investigation indicates an apparent lack of comprehension on the part of the investigating officer of the normal disorganization of small unit combat and of the unbalancing effects of the horrors and shocks, the shock of Dachau on combat troops already fatigued with more than 30 days continuous combat action. In the opinion of the undersigned, and bear in mind, this is written by a general. It's not just some guy they dragged off the street to fob the whole thing off. He says, in the opinion of the undersigned, the investigation indicates further an apparent attempt to accentuate testimony unfavorable to the participants rather than to develop the investigation impartially. Since it was not felt that the foregoing investigation conducted by the Inspector General, this headquarters gives a true and unbiased conclusion after considering all the factors, including the extenuating circumstances. It is recommended that circumstances surrounding the alleged mistreatment and shooting of German guards in the concentration camp at Dachau, Germany, be reinvestigated. But they never did that either because Patton just squashed it and that was the end of that. Okay, so everybody who shot prisoners went free and nobody was prosecuted at all. And like I said, rumors floated around until the Day of the Avenger came out, and then several years later, you know, the Dachau, the original investigative detective stuff came out. And like I said, I only noticed it by accident when I was hunting for other stuff. And then I told David Irving one day, I said, oh, you know, I found that report of Dachau, and he said, what? And so then we had to typeset it and make it all fancy for him so that he'd be able to read it good. Now, let's see. Is there a little bit of time to tell them about some other legal cases, or is that okay? Okay. Just so that you'll know, I wanted to bring up some other cases. When we were in Washington, we went to the judge advocates section of the Army and asked them for permission to see trial transcripts of other cases where prisoners of war were executed, and I just wanted to tell you a few of them so that you'd be able to see. These are the transcripts of 3 court-martials which took place in the U.S. Army. 2 of them were massacres of Italian and German prisoners. In the one case, a Sergeant West had massacred with a Tommy gun approximately 40 prisoners. There were a few Germans and mostly Italians, though. He was ordered to take these prisoners, which had surrendered on Sicily near Biscari Airport, to the prisoner of war holding place. And he was specifically ordered not to harm them in any way, but just to take them there. But when he was partway to the prisoner of war compound, he decided that he was just going to kill them all. What happened was he killed approximately 30 to 40 of them, and amazingly, some of the prisoners tried to escape. When he opened up, he ran out of ammunition, evidently, and sat down. when he sat down getting ready to kill the rest of them, a U.S. Army chaplain came by and said, "What are you doing?" Or he noticed the guy sitting there with a gun and the dead people, and the Sergeant West said, "Oh, I guess you're here to give everybody last rites, huh?" And the chaplain said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he says, "Well, I'm going to kill all these guys, the rest of them now, so, you know, you better talk to them before I kill them." The chaplain immediately went to the U.S. Army authorities. The U.S. Army authorities moved in, arrested Sergeant West. He was charged with murder, and here's what his defense was. His defense was that he was having a real bad day. Okay? No, he actually said that. He said that it was tough being in combat, and he said that besides all that, he said that General Patton gave them a big violent speech before the landing on Sicily and said basically kill, 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 where Patton told the men in his outfit, and by the way, again, it was the 45th Division again, the same division, and that Patton gave him a big speech and said, any enemy soldier who surrenders at less than 200 yards from you, when the Axis soldiers raise their hand to surrender, you stick a bayonet in their chest. Okay? So West's defense was he was having a bad day, and Patton said don't let anybody surrender. Okay, now, because he had openly disobeyed the orders of a superior officer who told him don't hurt these people, take them to prisoner of war camp, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Okay? His brother wrote a letter to his congressman and to the Army and said that he didn't think it was right that his brother be sentenced to jail because, after all, he was a soldier, and he was a brave soldier, and he was a real good soldier, and he wanted to know why they'd put such a fine guy in jail. And so after like a year or so went by, the Army gave him complete amnesty and dropped the rest of his sentence. Okay, so that's what happened to him. His punishment was that he was broken in rank from sergeant to private. So when the next time you kill 35 Italians, then during the war, then you get maybe a year in jail and you can't be a sergeant anymore. Now, I say that somewhat sarcastically, but the only reason is because at the same time you're preparing war crimes trials for everybody else, and then the sergeant is having a bad day, and Patton said, gave a big speech, and that's okay. It's okay. It doesn't matter. They were just Italians. Okay, now that's the West case. At the same, oh yes?
Was this the occasion where the Germans actually saw the execution of the soldiers? Because I was just reading a book on the Sicily campaign where the Germans saw the killing of prisoners, and they dug in and fought much harder and held up the Americans. I really don't know.
I hadn't heard that part. Mainly what I know about those cases is from the court-martial records. Mm-hmm. Oh, I'd like to see that. Now, there was a lieutenant near the same airfield, and what happened to him was he was in a woody section near a gully, and the Italians opened fire on him from behind, behind the trees and stuff like this. Well, after a firefight went on for a while, the Italians decided that it was time to surrender. They all surrendered, and the lieutenant killed them all. Okay, killed them all. He told his men, let these guys have it, and they shot everybody standing there except for one Italian who ran away, and they shot him in the back. Okay, now he was brought up on trials of murder, and the amazing thing is that his total defense was this. He said that he listened to General Patton's speech. General Patton said any soldiers shooting at you less than 200 yards, put a bayonet in their chest, and he says, I make it a policy to obey the orders of a general any time. He said, I killed those Italians and I'd do it again. That was his defense. Okay, yes?
In Nuremberg, the Germans were told to let their conscience be their guide.
Uh-huh. Well, it didn't work too much with Lieutenant Compton. No. Now, Compton's case is very, very interesting because Compton called upon witness after witness after witness after witness, tons of guys from his unit, and they all said, yeah, they heard the speech by Patton, and Patton said stick a bayonet in their chest. Okay, so the court-martial concluded that since Patton did say that, and since he was a general, and it was superior orders justified Compton's conduct, his sentence was no punishment, exonerated on all charges. Okay, now, there's another one. And I'll do this real quick. Some of you might know that in 1944, the U.S. Army changed their handbook. The handbook previous to 1944 said that in war crimes cases, the commanding officer was to be charged with war crimes, but the enlisted men were only obeying the orders of a superior officer. But in 1944, they changed that to specifically include the enlisted men, and that's why this case, this is the Okunto case, is very important. What happened was that a officer in the U.S. Army named Okunto had received German prisoners in April 1945, and he promptly said to his men, hey, anybody want to help me shoot these guys? So he got volunteers from his army unit. They went off into the woods and killed everybody. Okay, one of the Americans turned the case in. It was investigated. Okunto was brought to trial. At the trial, Okunto said that he didn't know you weren't supposed to shoot prisoners because his unit did it all the time. And he said he never read the Army handbook, so he didn't know about how to treat prisoners. And so he just didn't know that it was wrong. And the court-martial ruled that since he didn't know, that he was exonerated on all charges. Okay? Now, by the way, the Compton case where the lieutenant got off with no penalty because he was following superior orders was ordered secret, not to be revealed to the press, okay, and was kept in a safe of the Assistant Secretary of War till 1951. Okay, and one of the reasons it says that it had to be kept secret because to reveal it would give aid and comfort to the enemy. And one of the reasons is because the Germans that we put on trial could use that as justification under U.S. law. You see? Now, my point is not that Germans never committed atrocities, okay, because I'm sure that almost everybody here thinks that on some other occasion that somebody did, okay, and some of us are more convinced that more. But the point is, for consistency, it's necessary to enforce your own laws on your own troops before you push them off on somebody else. And, thank you. And
Did these three cases all take place after the revision in the handbook?
The 1945 case took place after the revision in the handbook, and the two Sicilian cases took place before. But I think really the truth is that no army wants to convict any of its own men. The army's in business to annihilate the enemies, and if some soldiers get carried away, they just kind of figure, well, that's sort of too bad. That's what Patton thought. But I wanted to read a quote from General Eisenhower from what he said, and then I'll leave you with that. This is a letter composed by General Eisenhower when he heard rumors in the summer of 1945 that the U.S. had killed some prisoners. He says, America's moral position will be undermined and her reputation for fair dealing debased if criminal conduct of a like character by her own armed forces is condoned and unpunished by those of us responsible for defending her honor. Okay? Now, he ordered an investigation on the reports that German prisoners had been killed. The investigation came back and said, well, we've kind of done everything we could. And that was it. Now, it lists a report on the Dachau case, and I'll just mention this. Sorry for taking so long for finding this. The report that was issued back to General Eisenhower said, from the brief account submitted by the Third Army, it appears that there was a violation of the letter of international law about the Dachau massacre. In that, the SS guards seem to have been shot without trial, but in the light of the conditions which greeted the eyes of the first combat troops to reach Dachau, it is not believed that justice or equity demand that the difficult and perhaps impossible task of fixing individual responsibility now be undertaken. And it said the reports of Germans being shot were mostly isolated instances, grossly exaggerated. And that was it. That was the end of everything. The Eisenhower's letter and the report is just stuck in a file. And the Dachau, the specific comment on the Dachau case says that we can't prosecute him because the troops were all upset when they came into the camp, and that explains why they killed all those guys. And so that was it.
fascinating disposition, and it's fascinating to meet a man who's a one-subject man. His brain is totally full of the documents. He brought along his washing baskets full of the documents, but he didn't need them. He has it all in his head, and that's the way I always advise people to write books. Students come to me sometimes and say, Mr. Irving, I've got to write a dissertation, and I've done all the research for the last 5 years, and I don't know where to begin and how to start. I've got just filing cabinets full of documents, and I just don't know how to write the dissertation. And my advice to them is always the same. I say, go to a desert island somewhere and leave all the paper behind. It's all in your brain. And your brain has sorted it out. It's done the analytical work while you've been asleep. And just sit down and write it all down from memory. And it'll come out in the right sequence and in the right order of magnitude, and it'll get things into shape. And that's precisely what Charles has done for us today. The only thing that I dispute with him on are the magnitude of the Dachau massacre. I appreciate that he is being very cautious and he goes for the lower figures. If you look at the photographs, you've got more than 17 people lying by that wall. If you look at my Nuremberg book, for example, I actually published one of the photographs there showing, as he describes, the men standing there, the 3 men standing there with their hands in the air or their arms folded, and you can count the numbers of bodies lying along the wall, and you've got, to my estimate, rather more than 17. It's possible that the officers who were doing the inquiry and the investigation were all seeking to minimize what had happened. All the witnesses saying, oh, no, it wasn't all that many, it was only a few who got hurt. They seem to have been shot. In the words of the report, they seem to have been shot, the SS men. The reports that I have seen, the photographs of the marching columns of prisoners, which you can kind of tot up and say, well, there's 30 here marching and 40 there marching, and they're all going in the direction of that wall, imply to me that the figure may have been larger, and possibly we need to do more research there. On the Sicilian front, it's interesting to note what Charles didn't mention, that General Patton himself went through hell because of that particular episode. He was sent to London in 1944 in the belief that he would lead the D-Day invasion armies. And then the scandal came to light. And he was brought up before the headquarters of Eisenhower and ordered to account for himself, because the story that he had given orders for the shooting of the prisoners in Sicily had finally worked its way through the army chain of command, and it was decided that he could no longer be considered fit to command an army in the D-Day invasion battles, and the task went to Bradley instead. So he didn't escape scot-free. There was some responsibility taken by Patton for that. He refers to the episode in his diaries. It caused him immense anguish. It nearly had him thrown out of the US Army. And I'm sure that when Charles eventually delivers the manuscript, he will bear these facts in mind. So I'm sure you've got questions to ask. Yes, Mr. Schmidt.
First of all, I would, Mr.
Charles.
I would like to say that I didn't need to do American GIs. I went into American captivity in early May 1945, and I'm here today because of a couple of GIs. The one who prevented that I was delivered to the Russians. About documents, like the one put by Mr. Whittaker, I would be highly skeptical. Documents written in May 45, when all the camps were filled up with German POWs, including myself, half starving or some starving more than myself. The very difficult situation about that is that the soldiers that died in those camps at that time, they were stripped of their clothes, stripped of their dog tags, the bodies taken away, and to this day one cannot find the bodies. I know of one case where I was in the camp where I was. I saw only one body, by the way, or one dead German soldier there. But the Austrian registrar of death there, he has the names of 450 German soldiers that died. I don't know, and I think he got the names from soldiers that finally got out. You know, they went to him and said, oh, I know this guy died in the camp and so on.
Which camp are we talking about?
Lamba.
Lamba.
I was in Lamba. The 450 bodies have never been found. Anyway, my own, about documents, I'm writing my own story. In my own documents, I found one which from May 1945. I'm absolutely sure from 45, I couldn't make hands or feet out of it. There was something wrong with it. And
something typewritten on the back, which nowadays it looks very legitimate and so on. And then I figured out, something what happened? I wanted to get out of the German area to the Americans. And I needed marching papers in order to be not to be stopped by the German MPs on the way, which I might meet walking through the forest to the Americans. I had gone to first to a doctor who didn't want to release me. Then I went to a medic, and the medic said, "Well, I can't give it to you." I said, "Well, you need to type, right? I took my medical report, typed the stuff myself, fake, right? And with this, I went to the Americans. And I still have the paper today, but for 40 years, I have forgotten it. That's because I realized what I had written was not true.
And let us get back to the subject, can we?
Yeah, but anyway, about the biblical paper and the documents, one has to be careful. Time they were written in May 45, and Colonel Whittaker might have been, or the detective, might have been written with the eye to the future. And the question about Dachau is, even to this day, where are the bodies buried that were killed there?
That is a good question.
And they have not. If you go to West Germany, you go to Bad Kreuznach, you go to Dachau, and you say, "May I dig here or there?" And they say, "Oh, no, you can't do that." Because in Bad Kreuznach, another big camp, they will tell you that if we do that, we can't embarrass the Americans.
Well, I know in the case of the Dachau concentration camp, which that coal yard is still there. Only access to it is restricted. The English magazine after the battle wanted to go there to see whether what was still there, and they were denied admission by the German authorities.
Interesting.
You know?
That's very interesting.
Do we know for a fact that they were buried? Didn't they have a crematorium there? Do you think it's possible that they cremated?
The crematory facilities seem to be in pretty bad shape from the pictures I've seen, but I don't really know. Whittaker doesn't say anything about what happened. He just said that he came by and counted 17 bodies. The guys had gunshot heads to...
How many days later was that? Same day?
I'd say it was about a week to two later. I think it was like
Still
2 weeks.
there?
Yeah.
2 weeks?
I find that hard to
2
believe.
weeks?
Something like that. I could check through my stuff.
It'd be horrifying.
I forgot to look that up before I got up here. Yes?
This book, The Avenger, was written by one of the officers on the scene, right?
The medical officer.
Medical officer.
Yes.
I believe in this book, the number is 540.
Yeah, it was a really enormous figure, I remember.
Which is, how do you reconcile 17 or 18 or 20, whatever it had, the 540?
It's-
Because from the court martial records, or from the records that you found in 1945, quite clearly somebody would want to minimize the number, and then if you wrote a book later, of course, just probably report it death.
That is my fear, yes, that there may have been conflicting interests.
Yes, exactly.
And that you have to try and assess the figures from other sources, like the photographs of the marching columns of German prisoners, which are in the photographs taken by the US Signals Corps, which are in the National Archives now. And you can do that kind of calculation, and also descriptions by what people said. Field Marshal Milch wrote in his diary, which I had.
Yeah, I'd like to get that.
Well, you may have the manuscript. Yeah, he wrote in his diary a description of what the camp staff told him, still in the hospital, the medical staff, when he was in Dachau in 1946, held there by the Americans. The camp hospital staff told him whispered stories of what had happened when the Americans took the camp over. They dragged out everybody who was wearing a uniform and shot them. So the size of the massacre is a matter of some importance. Yes, Michael?
I thought it was an amazing story that perhaps you could expand a little bit in the limited time we have left to us. You tell us about Hitler's table talk. You tell us that if they cannot evacuate the prisoners somewhere else, they must be liquidated. Then Heinrich Himmler, this figure of the paragon of evil, is actually the one who arranges through Hermann Pister to have this humanitarian train prepared with food and with the ability to get them away. Otherwise, Himmler would be under orders to execute these people. I don't really think from reading your other research that Himmler is the evil genius of the Reich. It seems to me that St. Martin's Press made a mistake when they suppressed David Irving's biography of Goebbels, because that's the book that shows the evil genius of the Reich. And it seems to me that Himmler, as anomalous as it may seem, was to a certain extent a man with a heart for these people It would seem that way from the little snippet you
I don't
gave.
think that's necessarily so. I think that by April 1945, Heinrich Himmler was a very frightened man, and he was trying to buy time for himself. He had reasons to want to appear a moderate. I have to say that, but there's a very interesting episode in November 1941, which is I've frequently referred to, where Himmler telephones Heydrich from Hitler's bunker and writes a handwritten note saying that trainload of Jews from Berlin not to be liquidated, and they were already dead. They'd been shot that morning when they arrived in Riga. We now know from the British decoding files that that same evening, November the 30th, and the following day, December the 1st, Himmler sent 2 radio messages in code to the head of the SS unit responsible, Jeckeln, the head of the Einsatzgruppe, in which he said to Jeckeln, by your action in Riga this morning, killing the Berlin Jews, you have grossly exceeded the guidelines that were handed to you. You have acted without authorization. You are to report immediately to headquarters. And 4 days later, he reported to Himmler's headquarters, as we know from Himmler's recently found diary. He was hauled over the coals, and all the shooting of the Berlin and German Jews stopped for many months until it surreptitiously restarted. And this is in the recently released Himmler diaries. Nobody's commented on it. Nobody's commented on the fact that these British decodes of Himmler's own signals show quite clearly Himmler saying, you've grossly exceeded your guidelines and you've acted without authority in killing these Jews. You are to report to Hitler's headquarters immediately. The image given there exactly confirms what I said, of total lawlessness reigning on the Eastern Front. People doing as they wanted, which is, as the American commander said, the kind of thing that happens in war.
But in Himmler's defense, I would just add that if you look at the role of Conrad Morgan in the camps, which Chuck has helped to pioneer,
Oh, yes.
you do see his insistence on order and the rule of law in the Constitution.
Himmler was a very strange character, and one of these days I'd be very interested in writing his biography, finding out what made him tick. Yes.
I'm very much surprised that some people had been court-martialed. Because atrocities happened during the war, even under the order of some officers. And this didn't happen only in the Second World War, but also already during the First World War. And I'd like to mention a book, Generals Die in Bed. And this gives you a story how some prisoners had been, even if they raised their hands and had been killed. I know myself 2 things about 2 gentlemen. One, not directly, the other one is a colleague of mine who went to through the same school. He was in the Western Front and captured by the Canadians. And he saw himself, he was fortunate, he was a little bit on the short side and was able to hide quite well. And he personally saw how some Canadian soldiers killed German prisoners who gave their heads. Another thing is a colleague of mine who knows an officer who was on the Western Front. He was approached by a soldier. He came to him and said, sir, what shall I do with the prisoners? We got quite a few prisoners. Get rid of them.
Yeah.
That was the saying. And another saying, what was quite widely, and I was very much surprised, what was widely used, the best German is a dead German.
Yeah.
And that was even in a documentary scene.
Well, there's a very famous episode in the First World War when the British cruiser HMS Baralong captured the crew of a German submarine, took them on board, and then ruthlessly murdered every single member of that crew. A very famous episode, which even Winston Churchill was shocked about when he heard. But in the Americans' defense, I will mention one other episode, which is a rather shocking episode when a trainload of German prisoners was left standing in, I think, March or April 1945 on an open railroad siding outside Frankfurt for over a week, and 900 German prisoners died. And Eisenhower, when he learned about this, and I've reported this in my book, The War Between the Generals, I've got this from the Eisenhower archives in Abilene, Kansas. Eisenhower ordered a letter of apology sent with his name to the German High Command through Swiss channels, apologizing for this infraction of the Geneva Convention, saying it was entirely unintended, and he could assure that he would take steps to punish the guilty. And his telegram, Eisenhower's telegram, signed by Eisenhower, addressed to the German High Command, apologizing to them, is in his files in Abilene, Kansas. You didn't-
David, did he punish the guilty?
That I don't know. I don't suppose they bothered to find it. Selina, yes.
How Eisenhower can be so sanctimonious and do this when we look and we know what he did with the prisoners after the war,
Well,
and how many millions did he starve to death, to the point of shooting the relatives that will come with food to the camps, and when he sent the Red Cross trains that came from Switzerland with tents and food, he sent them back.
Well, the one thing was happening in the public eye. Yes. I think Eisenhower was more of a politician than a soldier, and he was already window dressing for the future when he wrote documents like that, probably. It was no skin off his nose to write a document like that, and he did it because he knew he would use it later on, probably. Yes, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to say, in answer to a previous question, I just looked it up. The Whitaker report was finished on the 2nd of May, and the massacre took place at the very end of April. So it wasn't, it does seem unbelievable. 17 guys would be staying there for 2 weeks, but so it was only a few days.
Could this have been the same Whitaker that helped to kill Himmler?
I don't think so.
No, completely different. The man involved in Himmler's case was British.
Yes, right away. I'm sorry.
Yeah, my observation when I was at Dachau was that these ditches of a body floating away down the ditches impossible. They were simply training ditches.
Yes, I have photographs of the ditches with 1 or 2 bodies floating in them. They were given to me by a combat engineer battalion.
Was it possible for them to float away? I didn't see that.
Well, I'm sure it wasn't stagnant water. The water would have moved one direction or the other.
Well, the comment was made that they didn't know how many people, bodies were there because they floated away.
Well, they probably had better things to do than go around counting bodies.
There is a picture in the National Archives of one of the German soldiers being fished out of the water, where he's, I don't know whether he's floating or not, but his head's above the water and his body's in the water.
My other comment is that when these type of things come up, I always go back to remind that the act of war is not a soccer game. It's very barbaric. It brings out the worst on both sides, and I think we should all keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Well, here's what I'd say. There's a lot of things in life that are understandable without being justifiable. That's the way that I would view it.
Yeah. A couple more questions, then we'll wind it up, I think.
I have a very short one.
Question.
I personally had contact with a prisoner of a concentration camp, not only one but others, but who was imprisoned in the KZ as a criminal. After the Americans came, all the criminals who were in concentration camps were released as political
prisoners. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe some.
Wasn't a question.
more that.
Any more questions from somebody who hasn't asked one yet? Yes, in the corner.
Just wondering, what do you feel is Colonel Berkman's motivations for writing this book?
The motivations for Colonel Bruckner writing his book.
Without being able to get into his head, I myself noticed when I read his book that it's sort of, it's apparent to me that he's embarrassed at the killing of unarmed prisoners, but at the same time he attempts to find a mystical reason why it's okay. So he has, you know, Lieutenant Bushyhead from his Indian past somehow avenging something by killing people who had nothing to do. By the way, it is an interesting fact, and I should have mentioned it earlier, but I didn't get out. It turns out that after all this, that the guards that were killed were not concentration camp guards. The concentration camp guards had fled when they heard the Americans were coming. The mayor of the city nearby requested from the German armed forces that a temporary garrison of German soldiers that they could round up would hold order in the camp and then surrender it to the Americans. So it turns out that the people who were murdered had nothing at all to do with the execution of prisoners, which makes it even more tragic. And
I think a question which interests me, which Charles can probably answer, is what happened to Buchner? Did he leave a widow? What happened to all those who were responsible? Have you made any attempt to contact them? When did they die, or are they still alive?
Lieutenant Bushyhead is dead. Lieutenant Walsh lives near my house within driving distance. Believe it or not, I found it by accident. He has Alzheimer's disease, and And then Medical Officer Buchner, I understand, had passed away within the last year or so.
And his widow?
His widow is still alive, and she has made a very good Mexican cookbook, which I bought off of her, and it's really good. And so I've had some correspondence with her. Yes, I always think real life is much stranger than a novel. So,
Sure is.
Well, on that note, ladies and gentlemen, real life, real history. We're going to end today's conference, this weekend conference, which has gone more successfully than I had dared to hope.